to explore one fundamental theme, which is that people can flourish in all sorts of body minds. To flourish here means to exercise the capacities we have in pursuit of the purposes we find meaningful. We don't need different body minds to flourish. What we need are more supportive environments. Now, no one ever articulated our theme more powerfully than the late disability rights activist Adrienne Ash, who introduced the social model of disability to the field of bioethics way back in the 1980s. Way back in the 1990s, Adrienne and I led a project built around the bioethical dilemmas that arise when non-disabled people selectively abort fetuses based on disability status. Indeed, when Rosemarie Joel and I conceived of this series in 2018, we assumed that to get at our project's fundamental theme, we would explore a series of dilemmas that would, at least in some ways, resemble the dilemmas that arise in the prenatal context. Indeed, the original plan was for this final event in our series to be a return to the dilemmas that arise when people who are advocates for reproductive choice and who are also advocates for disability justice contemplate using prenatal technologies. But over the course of this series, we have felt ever less need to use a bioethical dilemma about a technology as an alibi for articulating our fundamental theme. And we have become ever more eager to simply explore how people can and do flourish within supportive environments. In previous events, our speakers have reflected on their own ways of engaging in various activities that can promote flourishing, including communicating, navigating, and enjoying. And today, instead of focusing on the prenatal dilemmas, we're going to shift to focusing on the activity or activities of family making. This shift strikes me as important. There's a way in which using the prenatal testing dilemmas as the occasion for articulating our fundamental theme would have placed non-disabled people at the center of the conversation. It would have placed disabled people in the position of having to say things like, quote, "You non-disabled people, in acting out of ignorance of what life with disability is really like, are making an ethical mistake when you refuse to welcome babies with disabilities into your families," end quote of hypothetical speaker. Instead, today we are articulating our theme in a way that both foregrounds the lived experience of disability and invites others to recognize its richness. We are saying, look here, this is a way that disabled people are flourishing, making families, and expanding what it means to be in kinship with others. We will hear 3 presentations today prepared by a total of 6 contributors. For more information about our contributors' backgrounds and accomplishments, please go to the registration page, which should be in the chat any moment now. The creators of our first presentation, each of whom is a professor of gender and women's studies, are Jina Kim, Jess Waggoner, and Sami Schalk. As many of you know, doulas support pregnant people as they bring babies into the world. Jina, Jess, and Sami will focus on what they call queercrip doulaing, which refers to, as they will explain, queer and trans people with disabilities helping to bring young queer people into kin relationships with other people who share their identities. The creators of our second presentation are Leah Smith and Joe Stramondo. Joe is a professor of philosophy and Leah is an activist. They will speak to what it is like to try to adopt children with disabilities like their own. Mia Mingus will offer the third of our presentations. Mia is an educator and trainer for disability justice who will talk about the forms of kinship that can grow around what she calls access intimacy. That is, Mia will speak about how having one's access needs recognized and recognizing the access needs of others can give rise to forms of kinship not dreamed of in the traditional model of the nuclear family. So again, our aim is to talk about disabled people flourishing, which, as with any sort of talk, is not without its dangers. We might say about our conversation on family making today, something like what Julia Watts-Belzer said at our last event when we talked about the activity of enjoying. Julia said, quote, "There are risks when we talk about joy, that we make joy a prescription, a requirement, a precondition for belonging." Julia continues, "There's a risk that joy becomes just another way of judging. If you're not happy, you're doing it wrong," end quote. So plainly today, that is a risk we intend to avoid, but it may be one that is of concern to people, and it is one that people are welcome to bring up in the audience discussion after the break. So after Mia finishes her talk, Rosemary Garland Thompson will facilitate a brief conversation among our presenters. We will then take a 5-minute break, and after that, we will open it up for audience conversation. That conversation will be led by our colleague and friend, Joel Reynolds. So now it's my pleasure to turn the Zoom mic over to Jina. Jina?
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for coming. So our joint presentation is titled Sustaining Queercrip Kinship in Pandemic Times. We're going to begin with visual descriptions of the presenters and a content warning. So this is Jina speaking. I am a Korean American woman with glasses and frosted blonde tips. I'm wearing a Dalmatian sweater, vest, and a blue button-down shirt.
And this is Jess Waggoner speaking. I am a white person with pink hair and pink lipstick. Behind me is a Dolly Parton pillow and a Black Lives Matter sign, and my pronouns are they, them.
And this is Sami. I am a fat Black woman with short curly hair. I'm wearing a teal dress with lace at the chest, animal print glasses a la Lisa Frank, and also there's a cat on my desk right now, so there may be a black cat occasionally in front of me during this talk.
So before we begin, we wanted to give some content notifications for discussions of ableism, transphobia, and brief references to suicide. So please do what you need to take care of yourself. And now to begin, this is Jina reading. In Staying with a Trouble, Donna Haraway urges readers to, quote, "make kin, not babies," end quote. Haraway's call brings to mind longstanding conversations in queer studies around the necessity of theorizing family and affiliation beyond the rubrics of blood or biological relation. But what does it mean for disabled people and in particular queer and trans disabled people, to make kin? And what does it mean for us to make kin when systems of white supremacy, ableism, and heterosexism so often disrupt the life-sustaining connections we do create, the ways we love each other in excess of and despite these systems that insist otherwise? Finally, how do we forge these lines of intimate kinship during a pandemic, in which traditional ideas around family and household have fundamentally shaped mainstream discussions around safety, public health, and collective responsibility? Driven by these questions, we want to share with today's audience some of the ways we've learned to both create and sustain kinship ties through practices grounded in disability and queer politics. For us, making queercrip kinship is not just about the what of it, but also about the how. That is, the practices we engage in order to forge these ties. We define queercrip kinship practices as the things we do to create and sustain close connections as queer and trans disabled people in ways that are akin to family making, yet distinctly challenge traditional notions of what family is, means, or does. This is by no means a comprehensive overview. There exist many, many ways to make queercrip kin, some of which disability scholars Alison Kafer and Shada Kafai have described in their own writings on this topic. For the purposes of this presentation, we focus on the practice most relevant to us during the pandemic thus far, queercrip doula work. We developed this term building on the work of disability justice activist Leah Lakshmi Paipchna Samarasinghe, PIEP-ZNA, SAMARASINHA, and Stacey Park Milburn, MILBERN, who coined the term disability doulaing to describe birthing and ushering people into a newly acquired disability identity. In this way, we issue a queercrip challenge to the concepts of family expansion, birth, and reproduction, particularly within the context of a mass disabling event that is rapidly expanding the ranks of those who we might consider crip kin. We issue this challenge to address how the COVID-19 pandemic and the suggested best practices for reducing viral transformation have simultaneously reinforced and disrupted dominant understandings of family. That is, who quote unquote counts as kin and the ways we connect with those who do count. In 2020, public health discourse framed friendship and the practice of visiting friends or anyone outside of immediate family as hazardous to collective safety, elevating the isolated nuclear household as the pandemic gold standard. As disabled queer people who live alone, rely on local community ties for survival, have robust chosen families, and maintain intentional distance from our families of origin, we felt particularly alienated by the set of recommendations that, to our minds, framed queer and non-familial forms of relating as potential threats of contagion. On the other hand, quarantine also provided some relief to those of us looking for a reason to avoid our families of origin, especially during the holiday season when feelings of obligation run high. All the while, we have drawn upon time-honored queer and crip strategies to maintain connection while living under systems of enforced isolation, which we want to add, queer and disabled people have long endured. These strategies, such as long distance and digital communication, have helped us cultivate our chosen family networks in a time where touch and physical presence are not guaranteed. Throughout the presentation, we draw upon our personal experiences with queercrip doulaing with our nibblings. Nibbling is an all-gender term we use to refer to the children and teens in our lives for whom we act as queer aunties, gunkles, that is, gay uncles, and fairy godparents. Some of our nibblings have biological or legal connections to us, and some do not, but they are all our nibblings simply by existing in our lives and being an adult-child care relationships with us. Passing it on to Jess.
Thank you. Vignette 1, Gay Bacon. E's message appears from the Discord server he created for us, Gay Bacon. Voice chat, anyone? A call across space and time for mundane virtual co-presence with queercrip adults. In a time where physical touch and sharing air has become hazardous, these modes of connection have become especially precious access technologies. We discuss the ways our particular disabilities interfere with or gently shape our desired gender presentations. Binders to flatten the chest that are accessible in low pain can be particularly out of reach for disabled trans people. Some masculine clothing, such as pants, is constricting and difficult to navigate with the pain issues we share. We elevate stretchy fabrics as a transcript revelation. I disclose that my thwarted desires to bind and wear more structured clothing has also moved me toward accepting my disabled body as a trans body, as is. We try on pronouns, discuss the possibilities of keeping our birth names, and generally exist in crip space, the familiar neurodivergent rhythms of aimlessly hanging on video, the show and tell of objects in our space, sharing music and gushing over service dogs and ESAs between tough questions such as, how do I really know I'm trans? Under the mossy growth of pandemic temporalities, some young trans people have found the space to thrive. Others are isolated from their friends and queer kin, or trapped in unsupportive, oblivious, or phobic family dynamics, dynamics which are indeed disabling. They witness the unfolding of harmful legislation targeting trans youth, and they question if they are indeed really trans. Some of them we have lost or are losing. This uptick in loss is directly linked to anti-trans legislation that invalidates trans youth, while the COVID-19 pandemic traps them in unsafe living situations. These bills send a message to trans youth that they should not exist and impedes their access to life-saving care. Vignette 2, Cripping the Bisexual Chair Meme. As the pandemic reshapes many of our relationships with outdoor spaces, A, never an outdoor kid and often sensorially opposed to nature, will still deign to sit in camp chairs outside and make absurdist queer art with me. King of the Hills Bobby Hill, radiating rainbows, or a propane tank emblazoned against a trans flag. At 11 years old, A is a constant stream of self-educated, neurodivergent queer literacies, which he weaves into his love of 90s cartoons, despite the current proliferation of queer cartoons for young adults at his disposal. He prefers strange juxtapositions, queer takeovers, and reparative readings of media that is sometimes downright queer hostile. As we listen to disabled trans musician Cavetown gently satirize angry, toxic young masculinities, don't mess with me, I'm a big boy now and I'm very scary. A is draping himself over the camp chair at the oddest angles, and I'm compelled to share the bisexuals can't sit in chairs properly meme. I joke to him that I am always already bi because my pain levels make it so I can never sit in a chair properly. Something clicks, and in communion with me, he is intentionally wrecking this chair with his contortions, reveling in the deep bi-ness of strange posture. This gentle play space, instead of the blunt edge of, what are you? How do you identify? This neuroqueer rerouting of gender through revision, mystery, and absurdity places us on a twisting path to the current moment, where he asks us to use a new name and he, him pronouns for the very first time. And now I'm going to hand it off to Sami.
This is Sami speaking. Vignette 3, Community Consultation. E has received a new disability diagnosis, hypermobility. The nurses at school send them home when his hip comes out of socket or calls his brother to pop back in a shoulder. Wanting to help E with their practical access needs, as well as this new disability identity, we connect him with a friend with a similar disability, a friend who is also trans, also queer. On a Saturday afternoon, we all hop on a Zoom call, E in their room with his mom, who asks questions, takes notes. Our disabled queer trans friend works as an advocate and helps E and his mom prepare for an upcoming accommodation meeting with the school. But he also talks to E about mobility aids and the importance of being open to them, practicing with them, and learning which ones work best for one's body before there is a desperate need, an emergency. This queercrip doulaing conversation teaches about how to advocate for oneself, how to face internalized ableism and compulsory able-bodiedness, and shares the wisdom of queercrip community. We all leave the conversation nourished, fortified by this connection, this process of bringing another person into the family. E begins to call the queer, trans, and disabled adults we introduce them to his cousins, understanding these connections as forms of kinship long before we teach him the words we use just to describe it. Welcome to the family, kiddo. We love you as you are. We welcome you as you are. There's a place for you here with us. The COVID-19 pandemic has taught us to move deeply in crip time, to revel in the joy of togetherness in whatever medium we find it, to deeply attune ourselves to one another's access vibrations, to remain open to our ever-shifting needs. Being a part of these conversations with our nibblings has been healing for us. Every time we think, what would we have done? Who could we have been if we had had a queer or disabled adult around who let us know we were perfect as we were, that we were going to be okay? Someone who gave us words for our desires, for what was happening with our body minds. Loving our queer, trans, and disabled nibblings is a way for us to love the young, queer, disabled people we were, who had to hide, who experienced so much shame and isolation, surrounded by biological family, but completely without kin. Indeed, this process of queercrip doulaing is not a linear distribution of knowledge from elder queercrip to queercrip youth. Our nibblings have shown us the power of vulnerability from queer disabled adults. In allowing ourselves to be seen by them and seeing them in turn, we have come to understand ourselves better. Queercrip doulaing shows us that better queercrip worlds are possible. When people are connected to loving, safe community, including digital community, where they can understand their identities, they don't have to experience the same kind of isolation, shame, stigma, or fear many of us have spent years undoing. We heal as we help, as we usher others into community, into queercrip kinship. Thank you. We'll now hand it off to Leah and Joe.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that wonderful talk on crip kinship, queer crip kinship. It was so critical and important and interesting. And we are going to now shift gears a little bit to talk about a more traditional view of family making that nevertheless, I think can be problematized and brought into conversation with some of these questions that were introduced in the first talk.
Let's first do image description.
Yes, yeah, I was about to do that. So before we get into the meat of our presentation, I wanted to do some image descriptions. I am a white man with dwarfism that has a dark beard and thinning dark hair. I'm wearing some round glasses and a white and dark blue checkered shirt, buttoned up. And we are sitting in a bedroom office.
My name is Leah, and I am sitting next to Joe, and I have chin length brown hair and glasses and a black top on. Behind us is a window and a door. So, all right, go for it, Joe.
Okay, so the name of our talk is Parenting While Disabled from Eugenic Deficit to Disability Gain. And the plan is to try to turn on its head the presumption that disability is a deficit or a liability when being a parent. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start off with some quick comments about the history of eugenics. So we have the famous Buck versus Bell case, where Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes had his comment that is infamous: 3 generations of, excuse the ableist language, idiots is enough. And this case and others like it that framed disability as part of the eugenics movement really showed how a primary feature of historical eugenics was its emphasis on who is fit to become a parent, who is fit to raise children. And so, of course, eugenics wasn't just one thing, but was many things, and it had a complex nature to its ideology. But one of its prime pieces was that it determined, or it supposedly tried to articulate, what qualifies a person as a parent and what qualities they should have if they are going to be a good parent. Because it wasn't just about who was passing on what hereditary traits, but also about what traits the parent had as parents that made them a good parent. Next slide, please. And so, as you might know, the qualities of a good parent, as articulated by the eugenics movement, continue to present day, and still are very common when thinking about what a good parent looks like or who a good parent is. And so we would like to suggest that some of these qualities can be sort of traced back into the eugenic history of the United States. And so typically we have white, English-speaking people are good parents, upper middle class people with generational wealth, heterosexual people, cisgender people, people in traditional family roles in sort of the traditional 2-parent man and woman household, and of course non-disabled are all the characteristics of a allegedly good parent that we can sort of see the eugenics roots of.
So when we were creating the slides for this presentation, I just quickly Googled good parent to see what images showed up. And those are the images on the right. And as you can see, they all, I didn't do any searching other than the first ones that popped up. And they all fit that description really well. The white, upper middle class, heterosexual and cisgendered, traditional gender family roles, and non-disabled is the images that you see here. And so that was pretty telling. We had written the slide before we had shown the images. So next slide, please. So in about a decade ago, Rocking the Cradle, which was a National Council on Disability report on disabled parents, came out. And of that report, there was a lot of common assumptions that disability as a parenting deficit that came out. So there was a disproportionate and devastatingly high rate of losing parental rights through child welfare system. Of those, psychiatric disabilities were 70 to 80%. The intellectual disabilities were 40 to 80%. Another finding, discrimination against disabled parents in custody or visitation disputes, and also barriers for disabled parents to adopt children domestically and internationally. So those barriers included violations of the ADA, discrimination by adoption agencies, and discrimination in international adoptions. Next slide, please.
So there are additional ableist barriers to parenthood that we thought worth at least briefly mentioning. As we all know, access to healthcare generally is a real issue for many disabled people who tend to be under or unemployed, and therefore, with our current situation in the United States especially, employment is directly tied to access to healthcare via employer health insurance. But in particular, there is a problem when it comes to reproductive healthcare and access for disabled people. And the reasons are complex, but it's sort of worth noting that it's a thing. Another barrier to parenthood is SSI marriage penalties. This is where you lose benefits from the federal government if you get married, and so disability benefits can be put at risk by marriage. Now, certainly, marriage ought not to be, a precondition to parenthood or a necessary condition to parenthood, but for many people, that is, what they choose, and so we can see marriage penalties as a ableist barrier to parenthood for disabled people. And then finally, the availability of parenting assistive technology. So like the social model says, the world, the social and built and technological environment is not made for disabled people. And so sometimes we need assistive technology or access that looks a bit different from what is standard. And so a lot of times those kinds of assistive technologies are very, very hard to come by, including accessible cribs and strollers and so on and so forth. The list goes on. I think Leah wanted to say a few words about
the image to the right is the image of, spoiler alert, our two kids. Hazel is our oldest, and she is reading a book to our youngest, Silas. But they are sitting inside of an accessible crib. It's a barn door style crib that opens in the front so that we can reach them as babies, or that we could have reached them as babies. And so that's what the image is.
And it was very difficult to come by. We actually were gifted it from another disabled parent who mailed it to us, I think from Minnesota. And so that's how difficult it is to get some of these technologies. Next slide, please. So I want to shift gears a little bit here and sort of try to suggest to you all that we ought not to think about disability as a deficit or as a liability when it comes to parenting. To sort of pick up on the theme of disability in the art of flourishing, I want to talk about disability as a kind of parenting gain. And so here we're using the term disability gain, and the term originates actually within the deaf community, where it inverted the idea of hearing loss and instead started talking about deaf gain. And deaf gain was a term used to refer to the value added to the world by deaf culture and deaf people. And so this term has been adopted more broadly beyond the deaf community itself, and also is now used by other disabled folk. And so our claim is that the presumption that parenting is, that disability is a parenting deficit can and should also be inverted. And so we should start thinking about the ways in which disability is actually a parenting gain.
Next slide, please. So a little bit about our story. We met 12 years ago. And as we started dating and started to discuss our future, part of that was in family and what did we want our family to look like. And I have to say that one of the reasons I fell in love with Joe was because of his vision of family matched mine. And I didn't believe that disability was bad, and I wanted to embrace that in my children as well. And so we had a strong, from the get-go, we had a strong desire to adopt a child with our same disabilities, because we really believed in that notion that disabilities would be a gain in our parenting. And we believed that we brought a different perspective to that than a lot of parents did. So we went through the adoption process. We went actually through 2 failed adoptions. And in both of those cases, they were set up for open adoption, which meant that we were building a relationship with the biological moms before the adoption actually took place. And both of them had received a diagnosis of dwarfism and were very confused and didn't know exactly what that was going to mean for them. And I think there was I think it's safe to say that there was a whole lot of fear that was there. And so they immediately went into the adoption process and started to get to know Joe and I. And interestingly enough, we, as much as we wanted the adoptions to go through, in both situations, we became, ambassadors of some sort of what is disability and what does it look like. And from 2 biological parents that had never seen disability up close, had a lot of stigma and ableism of what they thought it was going to be, started to get to know Joe and I, and started to, they both reversed their decision. Oh, last slide, please. They both reversed their decision and decided that disability wasn't so bad after all. But what this really showed us was, this was not that much fun for us and a very expensive situation to go through in order to teach. So we really need better understandings of disability and parenting and what this looks like for people once they saw what life could be with a disability. And that is nothing about who Joe and I are. I think that it could have been anybody, but more, always advocating for more media, more representation of what disability is. But it really removed those fears, those stereotypes of disability as a deficit, and allowed them to imagine a life with their child that they weren't given from the diagnosis itself, right? So, and it also developed an understanding of disability as neutral or even as a positive for them. Next slide, please.
So we want to unpack this a little bit in terms of the next step in our journey, which was the birth of our 2 bio kids. And so we, when we came up with the idea for this talk, we started kicking around ideas about what disability gain looked like as parents through our experience. And of course, our experience is just sort of a very narrow slice, and I'm sure that there are lots of other examples of parenting disability gain. But what we can do is sort of give you a sense of what we've experienced here. And so there are, I think, 2 ways to think about parenting disability gain, or 2 sources of disability gain that we have experienced as parents. One is gains from disability as a social identity. In other words, the ways in which we as social persons and as sort of a particular political position that we occupy in the world offers something to our children. And then the second, which Leah will talk about in a minute, is the ways our bodies themselves actually offer a kind of disability gain, okay? And so, but before we get to the embodiment piece, I want to just sort of say that I think that, sometimes I imagine what my life would be like if I had been born average size, if I hadn't acquired a spinal cord injury, and so on and so forth. And when I think those sort of imaginary thoughts, thought experiments, right? I'm a philosopher. We love our thought experiments. I start thinking about how my perspective would have been so much more narrow. And so to get to ideas like difference and inclusion, social justice and fairness, self-acceptance, interdependence, and so on and so forth, I might have been able to get there, but it would have been harder without the lived experience of oppression. And so, there is this stereotype or this idea that disability is just there to teach non-disabled people some kind of life lesson, right? And that's something that disability activists often push back against, especially the folks that are looking at narratives in the media, right? And just sort of saying, well, we're not just here to teach you non-disabled folks a lesson or something, right? And I want to support that idea, but I also want to say that there's a big exception to that rule. I think that, in fact, disability should exist to teach a moral lesson when you're talking about your own kids, because in effect, I think that child rearing is, in fact, one giant experiment in teaching moral lessons. And so if we can use disability as a resource, as Rosemary Garland Thompson might say, when parenting, by opening up the world of our children to think about disability inclusion and difference, that goes even beyond disability itself into other marginalized identities, social justice and fairness, and so on and so forth, I think that's a good thing. Next slide, please.
So the other parenting gene is from disability as embodiment. So we have seen this with our two kids. One, if you ever read any kind of parenting article, one of the first things they'll always say is, get at eye level with your kids when you're dealing with conflict or when you're trying to reframe a situation or redirect. And so one thing that we found to be extremely positive for us and a disability gene is that we're 5 years in and we've been at eye level with our kids the whole time. And it's been, I definitely can see a difference and can see how, what a game that has been for us. The other thing is we are proponents for positive parenting, but also having two average sized children means that corporal punishment wouldn't be an option for us. And so that has been a huge game for us, is learning about using words only. There's no physical force. Our kids don't even know what that would mean. There's also we found that our kids understand bodily autonomy and consent probably better than some, or I definitely know better than some. Most of my back is fused, so I can't wrestle. Wrestling is just the tip of it. They know that they can't just jump on my back, or they have to be very careful with me. Silas often says, mommy is a gentle flower, which I particularly love. But that understanding that they have to ask my consent with my body, I think is so important. But also this sense of greater physical independence. When we got pregnant with Hazel and found out she was going to be average size, I was amazed at the number of people that said things like, oh my gosh, how are you going to teach her to ride a bike or play on the playground? Or how are you guys going to navigate that? And I'll be honest to say that we kind of said, we don't know. we're gonna figure that out. And it's been, I think Hazel, just because she's the oldest, has really taught us a lot of lessons in that, and that she has really navigated that on her own and really shown us what she can and will do on her own without us prompting it. The bike riding is a great example. We really pushed that. I think, we just waited for her to be ready and for her to decide when she was ready to ride a bike without training wheels. And last Christmas, we bought the bike, and we both kind of looked at each other and we're like, okay, here goes. Like, let's see what happens. And when Christmas morning she got up, we went outside, and I'm not kidding when I say she got on the bike and took off. And that was the extent of our teaching her how to ride without training wheels. But I think that it was huge on that. We waited for her to say when she was ready. We never pushed it. We never, and so she really has this great understanding of where her own limits are.
And just to expand on this idea of disability gain in parenting from embodiment itself, like I had said at the beginning, all we have is our own experience to refer to here. But one other example that came to mind as we were coming up with this talk was one that was offered by philosopher bioethicist Teresa Blankmeyer-Burke, who identifies as deaf and teaches at Gallaudet University. And she talks about in her chapter, Armchairs and Stairs, the idea that part of deaf gain comes from the physical embodiment of deafness and not just deaf culture. And one of her primary examples is how, as a parent, when you are trying to communicate with a child, as a deaf parent, you have to be very direct. You can't communicate in a way that the child has divided attention, right? If you're using lip reading, or if you're using sign, or whatever the mode is that's specific to your family, you need to have all of your focus on the child, and the child needs to have all of their focus on you. And so, it's not a matter of a child, okay, as they play their video game or look at their iPad or watch their cartoon, right? And so this is yet another example that's outside of our experience as little people of disability gain that is focused on parenting. And so that's the extent of our talk. I want to now.
Let's give a quick image.
Oh yeah, image description.
Yeah,
sorry.
There's an image here on the left of me and Hazel and Silas. They're both sitting in my lap. We're in the park, all wearing masks. But my lap is very full with two average-sized kids. So I believe that's the last slide.
Yeah, that's the last slide.
Right.
I think we want to hand it off now to Mia.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Is it me yet? Is it?
Yeah, Mia, you're up.
Okay, great. I don't know why I can't see anything. There we go. Hi, all. Thank you so much. I'm going to talk about access intimacy, and this is called Building Our Own Belonging. Disabled family making can take many forms. It does not only have to be the traditional nuclear parenting and child raising. Oh, actually, let me do a visual description. I am a Korean American woman presenting person, and I have a sleeveless black shirt on. My long hair is pulled back at the top only. I have large white shell-like, they look like a moon almost, earrings on. I'm sitting in a black office chair with a very, very boring white wall behind me that I am going to paint at some point, but it's just taken me a while. And I have black glasses on, I should say as well. Okay. Disabled family making can take many forms. It does not only have to be the traditional nuclear parenting and child raising. Here, I want to talk about disability family making more broadly, encompassing all the many ways that we are and become kin to each other, whether as best friends, partners, comrades, or any other kind of loving relationship where we experience belonging, no matter how big or how small. As a disabled queer adoptee of color, I understand family to be much more expansive and elastic than what we are usually taught. So it's important to me to name that I have had my disability since I was an infant, so my entire life. My physical disability has always been visible and formal. I was marked as disabled by the medical industrial complex, which was an ever-present part of my childhood until I was 18. I understood myself to be disabled since as far back as I can remember, and I was understood to be disabled by anyone who met me. I was a disabled baby, child, and teenager, and these experiences have profoundly and fundamentally shaped how I understand disability. In short, I have never understood myself to be able-bodied or abled. I've only known disability. I've only known an undeniably disabled life, and this is a particular lived experience, perspective, and culture that is distinct within the disability community. Disabled family making has been one of the most powerful experiences of my life. Powerful in its truest sense of a force that is able to cause effect. I say this because disabled family can be both world-altering, transformative, and transcendent, but it can also be incredibly scarring and heartbreaking. And sometimes it can be both. I don't want to lose the harder parts of disabled family making, especially when it does not work out, implodes, or traumatizes. Disabled people are often so hungry for genuine connection and belonging, especially in a world that tells us over and over again that we are wrong, undesirable, and a burden. For many of us who grew up with our disabilities, these sentiments were fully internalized from a very young age. And for all of us, no matter when we became disabled, these sentiments were widely understood and enforced. And of course, this is more compounded for disabled people with multiple oppressed identities. Because of this hunger, we often rush towards connection with an intensity that is hard to sustain. Many of us, myself included, are familiar with the crash and burn dynamics of these kinds of experiences. We so desperately long for relationships where we belong that when they fall apart, it could be nothing less than soul-crushing. Our longing for family is the ache for disabled belonging, and it is shaped so fundamentally by ableism and abled supremacy, by isolation, loneliness, stigma, and inaccessibility. We exist in a world that literally was not built for us materially, culturally, and socially. Because of inaccessibility, the mere act of finding each other is challenging enough, let alone figuring out how to move through the world together, especially if our access needs conflict. We are sold family by a dominant culture that glorifies nuclear families and family making. It tells us that family is the only place where true belonging happens, even if that contradicts our own experiences with family as disabled children. For most of us, we were the only disabled person in our families, and our parents did not know anything about disability outside of a medicalized understanding or how to raise and support a disabled child. The family I grew up in was not a place that could cultivate or hold disabled belonging. I share all of this because I don't want to romanticize disabled family making. It can be magnificent and it can also be painful. Some of my deepest heartbreak has come from family making in disabled community. The loss of disabled family has cut me to the bone, and there are still wounds that throb whenever I think about them. There's a deep contradiction that exists when we talk about things such as disabled family, belonging, love, and community, because most disabled people do not have access to these. Most disabled people are extremely isolated and are not connected to rich and wonderful disabled community. They are not leaders with status or clout. They do not live in areas with large politicized disabled communities, or they have been ostracized from those very communities, often pushed out by other disabled people. When we talk about the magic of disabled family, it can sting like something far worse than jealousy, envy, or shame, even as it awakens longing, inspiration, and pride. I think many of us have been on both sides of this, and I want to acknowledge the quiet river of grief that moves through us in these conversations and is present alongside our joy. Access intimacy has been a key part of what disabled belonging has meant for me. There is no belonging without access intimacy, no matter who I am in relationship with. Building disabled family has meant building a deep and fertile understanding of access intimacy and how it affects our lives, both in its presence and in its absence. In my essay, Access Intimacy, The Missing Link, I describe access intimacy as, quote, that elusive, hard to describe feeling when someone else gets your access needs. The kind of eerie comfort that your disabled self feels with someone on a purely access level. Sometimes it can happen with complete strangers, disabled or not, or sometimes it can be built over years. It could also be the way your body relaxes and opens up with someone when all your access needs are being met. It is not dependent on someone having a political understanding of disability, ableism, or access. Some of the people I have experienced the deepest access intimacy with, especially able-bodied people, have had no education or exposure to a political understanding of disability. Access intimacy is also the intimacy I feel with many other disabled and sick people who have an automatic understanding of access needs out of our shared, similar lived experience of the many different ways ableism manifests in our lives. Together, we share a kind of access intimacy that is ground level with no need for explanations. Instantly, we can hold the weight, emotion, logistics, isolation, trauma, fear, anxiety, and pain of access. I don't have to justify, and we are able to start from a place of steel vulnerability. It doesn't mean that our access looks the same or that we even know what each other's access needs are. It has taken the form of long talks into the night upon our first meeting, knowing glances shared across a room or in a group of able-bodied people, or the feeling of instant familiarity to be able to ask for help or support. It has felt like an unspoken, instinctual language between different people, like an entirely unique way of being able to communicate and connect. Similar to meeting someone you just click with, access intimacy has felt like a distinct form of attraction, desire, and energy onto itself. There is no way to separate disability from access, no way to separate myself as a disabled person from my access needs. As I write, quote, in my life, access intimacy is something that has been hard-won, organic, or at times even felt magical. It has taken me by surprise, showing up with people that I never would have expected to have that kind of access connection with. It has been exciting and relieving, like a long, slow exhale, unquote. Access intimacy has felt like a kind of disabled belonging onto itself, a feeling of home or comfort, as if I could take off my armor and be truly known. And that is how family should feel. There is no family for me where there is no access intimacy. To be understood fully means that access intimacy is present. Indeed, access intimacy is a kind of familial experience, no matter the magnitude. Even when access intimacy has existed in small moments, it has been no less impactful. Once, many years ago, when I was traveling alone for work, I got off the plane with the rest of the disabled passengers after everyone else had deboarded. There were 5 of us, and we were put onto a large electric cart while our mobility equipment was loaded in the back. As is usually the case, I was the youngest person there. There was another woman about 10 or 15 years older than I was, and 3 elders. We had been put directly onto the cart from the plane, and we were to be whisked off through the busy airport to our respective gates. As we left the gate, the woman politely asked the man driving if she could stop to use the bathroom. He quickly and flatly said, no. Please, sir, she asked again, explaining how our flight was delayed and getting in, and her connection was tight, so she would not be able to use the restroom again until after her next flight. 5 hours later. Again, the man said no, this time a little bit more forcefully as the cart weaved through the airport. The woman looked demoralized and a bit panicked as I spoke up firmly to say, she needs to go to the bathroom. You need to stop the cart and let her. I could see the others nodding in agreement, one elder holding his cane tight to him, motioning with it. The driver ignored me, but I kept telling him to stop as some of the others joined in as well. Finally, he blurted out, fine, I will stop and she can get out, but I am not waiting for her. It's her choice. The woman looked like she was going to cry, and the rest of us knew exactly how she felt. We launched into action, telling him that he would not drive away and that we would wait for her and anyone else who needed to use the restroom. We were yelling at him as gates flew by us and onlookers stared. Finally, spotting a restroom, he pulled the cart over and stopped. As we helped the woman off the cart, she said thank you through tears, and we told her to take as long as she needed. Myself and one other elder stood with one leg on the cart and another off, so that he could not move the cart without injuring us. We waited there like that until she got back and everyone was safely aboard. We all talked and laughed for the rest of the ride. We were strangers getting off that plane, but in that moment, we were family. We were disabled family who were going to protect and care for our kin. In that moment, we belonged with each other and we created belonging together out of our shared access intimacy. I never saw any of them again, but that experience has stayed with me. It rearranged something inside of me and opened up new space for more possibilities. It was a small experience, but its roots ran deep. I've had many small experiences of access intimacy, such as that one, and each of them have left my disabled self a little more whole, fortified, and nourished. One of the biggest and most profound experiences of disabled family that I've had is with my current partner of 11 years. I experienced access intimacy the moment I met her. Even though she had never been exposed to any kind of disability, community, or politics. Indeed, she is the one who inspired me to write the original essay on access intimacy in the first place. Over the years, our access intimacy has continued to grow and grow, deepening and expanding in ways that I, as a disabled woman of color, did not even know were possible. She also has become disabled in the last 5 years, and it has only enriched our shared access intimacy as two disabled queer Koreans. It was disability that was the fertile ground for our relationship to grow. And I believe it was access intimacy that even allowed for us to get to know each other in the first place, and now creates the capacity for the kind of love we share that is rooted in friendship, family, and partnership. Access intimacy is a kind of family making and a way of building belonging. Access intimacy is both an integral part of building disabled family and a practice of disabled family in and of itself. Access intimacy has felt like a kind of recognition of something inside of me that is so deeply familiar, like a part of me that had been lost and forgotten, a kind of awakening and returning back to oneself, reminding you that there are other ways to exist beyond scarcity, isolation, shame, and fear. Access intimacy reminds us of the power of love and softness, care, and understanding. It is a generative force that embraces need and grows belonging by its very nature. Disabled belonging, however it is built, creates new worlds and new possibilities. It has the power to grow the kinds of love and magnificence that are beyond what we can even imagine. Belonging is a force that can change us down to the cellular level, reorganizing molecules and transforming matter. There is no way to explain the alchemy of belonging, and there is no formula to create it. But I know for me, access intimacy has been a building block of disabled belonging and a path to family. I only wish that I had been able to experience access intimacy as a disabled child, to have been able to experience disabled belonging, especially as the ableist world swirled around me. I dream that future generations of disabled children will get to experience disabled belonging born out of family and forged through access intimacy. Thank you very much. I'll turn it back to you all.
Everybody can turn their cameras back on. And we'll move into the discussion with Rosemary.
Thank you very much for those really wonderful presentations. I'm Rosemary Garland Thompson. I am a pale-skinned, seniorish woman with silver chin-length hair and a dark sweater and red glasses. And I am joining you today from my home office in San Francisco. And I'm delighted to be here and to bring these speakers together today for about a 10-minute discussion of our papers, where you'll have the opportunity to speak with one another together. So I wanted to begin by offering one question about relatedness and resemblance. So we have all noted over the last number of years that calls for inclusion often invoke this idea that people want to have more, and I'm quoting here, people who look like me in their lives. And I've thought about how that might work with disability kinship in terms of resemblances and relatedness. And I wanted to know if we could all talk together, again, for about 10 minutes, about the relationship between kinship circles and relatedness and resemblance, how we all, that is to say, people who identify as disabled and people who are identified as disabled, how we might resemble each other or look like each other, be biologically similar, whether it's through genetic makeup, genetic relatedness, or morphological, biological relatedness, or through relatedness that has to do with our minds as well as our bodies, and how those kinds of distinctive resemblances or likenesses might help us forge more meaningful and new kinship networks. And of course, that's what all of us have been talking about, but I hope that we might be able to talk together about likeness, about resemblance, and how that operates specifically in what we might think of as disability kinship making and kinship circles. Joe and Leah, would you want to start, since you talked rather specifically about the contrast in resemblance, in looking like your children, and maybe even looking like and not alike one another, and maybe the rest of us can follow in.
Wow. Okay. I've been thinking about this question, and I think it's a really interesting and risky question to ask, right? In that I do think there is something there, right? There is something about disability embodiment that creates a tendency toward access intimacy, as Mia was talking about so eloquently, right? In that I do think that experiencing disability for me makes me more likely, perhaps, to put into the foreground access intimacy with others, right? I'm thinking of a specific set of experiences I had with our mutual friend, the late Stacey Park Milburn, when there was one time when we were meeting up in Washington, D.C., and we were going to get on the metro together, 2 power chair users, and I dropped my metro card on the ground, and of course she couldn't help me pick it up, and so I was going to climb out of my chair to get it. And so when I started doing that, without asking, she immediately sort of parked her wheelchair in front of me so that I wouldn't be seen climbing out of my chair. And she intuitively knew, and we talked about it afterwards, she just sort of intuitively knew that this was sort of a state of vulnerability for me, that being out of my chair was a situation in public where, you know, I was used to being seen in my chair. That was sort of my source of independence and power. And being out of my chair would be sort of something that would be too much intimacy for those around me that were not Stacy. And so I think that that's sort of what comes to mind when I'm thinking about the ways in which our embodiment sort of creates this space of just intuitive understanding of our commonality and our experiences. But here's a big but, right? I don't want to oversell that, because I think that there can be a lot of hierarchy within the disability community that I, especially as a cishet, white, upper middle class man, I really need to be attuned toward, right? And that's another lesson that Stacey Park Milbourne taught me, right? That disability isn't sort of a unified monolith, and that there is difference within difference, and that I have to recognize my own privilege and power as it is in my body, and don't sort of try to flatten the experience of disability to some kind of fairy tale commonality that doesn't exist. So that's I think my answer.
I'm reminded of a conversation I had with my 5-year-old the other day. She came in and out of the clear blue said, you know ways that we're the same and ways that we're different. And I said, what's that? I obviously could think of quite a few ways that we're different and ways that we're the same. And she said, we're the same because we both have the same eyes. And we both, what did she say? We both have the same eyes. We both have the same, we're both kind. And we both like to put, outfits together. And I said, yeah, that's true. And she said, you know how we're different. And I was like, oh, here we go. And because we are different. And she said, you have purple nail polish on and I don't. And I was like, wow, of all the things that she could have said in that moment, purple nail polish was the thing that got her, but I just am thinking of that conversation as we discuss this. But then, I think also on a deeper level, Joe and I deal with this a lot when we're out, and that we're both little people, but we're two different types of little people. And that's often very confusing to people. And we often laugh about how people interact with us and how different people are with us, and how his wheelchair is the first thing that they see, and they actually don't pay any attention to anything else. The wheelchair is so he's disabled in that aspect, whereas my body is the first thing that they notice with me. And some of that is sexism, some of that is gender, and there's all different kinds of things that at play here that we often talk about and discuss. But those are the two thoughts that came to my mind when you asked that.
Others?
This is Sami. I have a non-apparent disability, and so for me, the kind of recognizing kin comes through not the body at all. It comes through things like behaviors, or someone pulling out a TENS unit, putting it on. It's the things that people are doing, not just the bodies themselves. So I've been thinking about that. And Mia mentioned being an adoptee, and I'm a mixed race person who was raised by white people, and so for me, kinship has never been about seeing people who look like me, because I was not raised with people who look like me at all, and was often assumed to not be a part of the family. I'd be watching little cousins and people would think that I was some, babysitter that was hired. And so for me, so much of kinship is about that shared connection and shared experiences that we have. That becomes really important for me when thinking about disability and crip kinship, because what we share is often about the way that the world treats us, regardless of the way that our bodies appear.
Yeah, this is Jess speaking, and I wanted to sort of dovetail with some of the things that Sami was talking about and reflect on this in the context of trans disabled people, where some of us have to leverage pathology or diagnosis to strategically access gender affirming care, but then some of us don't have access to diagnosis or services to begin with. And to be clear, I understand disabled and trans experience as intimately connected and overlapping because of the disabling conditions that trans people face every day. And for many reasons, disabled trans people don't always visually recognize one another. And part of that can be due to, safety that doesn't allow us to present in the ways that we might want to, or because of pre-existing disabilities or illnesses or medical trauma that shapes what forms of care that we can access or want to access, or like a place where we might not want to change our presentation at all. And so we have to sort of generate these other ways to find one another, such as, virtual spaces or just a glance or a shift in tone. But I think it is one potential crip and trans ethic to not just use the visual as the most reliable register for finding one another.
Hi, this is Mia speaking. I was just going to add, so many of the things that everyone else has said were things that came up for me. And I just wanted to add one more piece, which is that, I think for me, like, even if I do recognize somebody as being disabled or a fellow crip or especially a fellow GIMP, like that's one piece of it. And also I think language plays a big part in recognizing, like, especially if if their disability is not visible, for example, or obvious. But I also feel like there's this piece that is just like descriptively recognizing somebody. But then that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a disabled identity, and whether it's politicized or not, but even that they understand themselves as disabled, because I have met so many, in particular, I think about like so many women of color who are disabled, visibly disabled, who, anybody would recognize as disabled in the tiny, narrow, terrible kind of understanding of disability that exists in dominant paradigms. But like, so many of those folks didn't identify as disabled, even though they were using a power chair, for example. And that's connected to stigma, but I think it's also connected to the ways that having multiple oppressed identities plays out, and that especially if you are oppressed by gender and race, identifying as disabled can be an incredibly dangerous thing and can threaten your survival. And so I think it's very complicated, the ways that we find each other, because even when I would try to have conversations with those folks, they absolutely knew what it was like to live a disabled life, but they did not identify as such.
This is Sami. I wanted to just jump back in because Mia, what you're saying reminds me of this, it's attributed to Zora Neale Hurston, but it's I think a general Black community saying that not all skin folk are kinfolk, right? So like the people who look like me are not necessarily my kin, and I can't assume that. And I think that goes across all identities, right? Like I've definitely met queer folks that I'm like, oh, we are not in community. Like we are in a very different place in terms of our understanding of like queerness, right? And I think that definitely goes for disability, and I think was very clear in Mia's presentation as well, right? That like disability community and other disabled folks can also break our hearts.
Can I also say sorry, are we done?
I'm sorry to interrupt. Mia, you can certainly finish your thought, but I did promise that we would have a 5-minute break for people to take a breath before we move on to the audience Q&A. So once you finish, Mia, I will put up the break slide.
Okay, I'm so, now I feel so awkward about it. Wait, I just wanted to say something to your second question, Rosemary, because I feel like, yes, there is the kind of new world making or whatever meaningful connections within like subcultures of under the large umbrella of like the disabled community or the disability community. Yes, there's tons of things, but also I think that when you find people where your access needs are different, but they really complement each other, that can be also like world life altering, you know, like fellow folks in power chairs who like, I can't walk long distances and they can just like zip down to the corner and get something for us that we need and come right back. Like that is also, I think, like its own special kind of like other world making in disability community.
I wanted to affirm, I know it's time, but what Mia was saying. I have an ongoing project with two of our colleagues in the disability community, one of whom is blind and the other is deaf. And then I have, I don't know, crippled, mobility impairment, however you want to talk about it. And the interdependence of when we work on things together or travel together is really very moving. And the way that we have developed expertises in using the world and the way we work with one another to be a unit, a triad, a trio, you know, a triangle of weird women or witches, if you will, is, as you have all suggested in our communities that we make, our chosen communities, our forged communities across disability identity and embodiment and experience. It's very moving and I think surprisingly effective to the rest of the world. So I want to thank all of you for talking about this with all of us today, and have a good break. And I look forward to these questions and the rest of the time. Thank you so much.
Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break. Let's try to be back, maybe 4 minutes, try to be back at 4:32. But if you need another couple minutes, that's okay. Okay, those who are back, feel free to turn your cameras back on.
Liz, am I good to go?
Yep, go ahead.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. We are now at the audience Q&A section of this event. My name is Joel Michael Reynolds. I'm a white person wearing glasses and a burgundy shirt that matches my nails. I made very careful to make sure I was matching. Got some tattoos, and I'm sitting at a chair in my apartment that is blurred out slightly, but not enough in the background. We have a number of fantastic questions from the audience. I would like to start with one from Catherine Hedges, Hedges. Catherine asks, what can you do if parent groups take over your local disability community and advance proposals that contradict what actual disabled people want? For example, promoting a disability registry with local police instead of alternative crisis responses. Would anyone like to take I was going to say stab, that's too violent. Take a jump? No, would anyone like to respond to that question?
This is Sami. I don't have this experience, but in terms of thinking about other organizing communities that I belong to, there isn't one community. Like we say disability community and queer community, but that's never the case. So I think it's okay to be like, that's what y'all are doing, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this other thing over here. And allow people to come in and be a part of it. But yeah, I think I would just challenge the idea of taking over and just say, we're going to go do something different. And I understand that can be hard when the thing they're advocating for is harmful. And I think it's good to be clear to people that you think what they're advocating for is harmful. But it's also okay, I think, for within a singular local community to take different directions in what people want to do or take on in terms of organizing work. And yeah, or decide to educate people, but it's not your job to educate everybody.
I'll just jump in and say that I think it should also be noted that there is a tension, I guess, between parents and people with disabilities, disabled people, whatever the identity is, often. And there's two, they're often put at kind of opposing views. And so I think the more, personally, because I am a disabled woman, I feel like I'm right, but I'm also a parent, right? So I understand the need to protect your child, but I think as much as we can push the narrative of, our firsthand experience of understanding, we wouldn't, I would hope, I'm sure it happens, but I would hope that we wouldn't do this in other marginalized communities if we, I know it happens, but, trying to compare it to other things to show that, we have the experience and we're kind of should be the experts here. And I know that that's way oversimplified, but I do want to just acknowledge this tension that happens oftentimes in these groups.
Can I say something? I also wanted to just sort of to speak to Sami's point. I think that's a really powerful and good point, as far as just sort of not getting too worked up about it, right? And just sort of instead doing your own work and setting off and doing your own thing. And I think sometimes that can be a really effective strategy I've seen happen in various disability communities across the country, where some folks were doing something that was really problematic, and instead of really trying to confront them or fight them on it, you just sort of set off and organize in your own way with your own goals. And I think it's great. I think the limit to that, though, is when the struggle exists within a single institution. I think that I've experienced this, where there might be an advocacy organization or some kind of institutional struggle for the soul of the organization, so to speak, right? Where you have groups pitted against each other within sort of a single structure, where it would be really, you'd lose something to try to go and leave and start your own thing. And so I think you need to be sort of careful with sort of thinking to yourself, well, is it really worth it, right? Is it worth it to have this fight in this particular structure for its, mission? Or, should I set off and do my own thing and maybe not, spend this energy on this particular fight?
Thank you so much for all those responses. I've got another question from the audience. This is from Felicia. I believe it's pronounced Spies, S-P-I-E-S-S. Felicia asks, I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on how we can make queer-crip space for our kin with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I work with people with cognitive disabilities, and I rarely see crossover or efforts within our community to make our movement accessible for people with different levels of cognitive ability and communicative skill.
This is Jess speaking. That's a great question. And I can just sort of offer some practical things that I've done, but I would be really excited to hear what others have to say. And just thinking in terms of community work, I think we can start with urging queer and trans community centers, support groups, social services, as well as more informal queer spaces and events to center accessibility for all disabled people. And some practical ways to do this on the macro level is to offer to attend or generate listening sessions for the boards of these community centers. Often these centers are thinking of disability access in terms of elder care, and they're not necessarily thinking about access cross-generationally or across disabilities. And the other component is to offer workshops on the intersectionality of disability and queerness for the boards, for support groups, and emphasizing to them that centering access for all disabled people is ultimately going to draw in more disabled queer and trans people, and allows us to recognize that so many queer and trans people are already disabled.
Yeah, Rosemary. I think you're muted, Rosemary.
In response to the question about creating accessible community for and with people with cognitive and developmental disabilities and neurodiversity, I'm working on projects, and many of us are, to translate some of the work that we all have done in disability studies and disability culture into plain language. I'm working with a bunch of different people to try to translate the New York Times articles, the personal essays on disability by people with disabilities, from New York Times language into plain language. And so that's one really important, I think, piece of work that we can all think about, is kind of communication access in terms of plain language. Thank you.
This is Mia. I just want to add to this, and I don't know where this lives, but I also think really having those queer and trans spaces confront the politics around desirability is key too, in addition to like the kind of logistical access, like this is how we can make spaces or make conversations more accessible. I think confronting our, particularly as in the queer and trans communities at large, our obsession with always needing to be desirable, and that a lot of those spaces, quite frankly, function as just like spaces to cruise each other or to find dates and get laid, have hookups. I don't know what the language the kids are using today, so I'm sorry if I'm dating myself, because I think that that's a huge part of it, of the stigma around and the accessibility at the same time around, particularly like folks who might have different kinds of communication skills or who might need longer to communicate what they are communicating, all different, whatever the ways, whatever their abilities may be and however that manifests. And I know that that's a really hard thing to do because I think actually a lot of queer culture, queer and trans culture is literally built around being desirable. So it might also mean that we think about what it means to be queer and trans and how we can do that in a non-ableist way. So yeah, go and do that. Simple.
So I'll repeat this in about 10 minutes, but I just want to say we have way more questions than we can possibly answer. That always happens with these events. We encourage any of you to reach out to our speakers, reach out to us on social media or via email or whatnot. We always save the questions in the chat and send them to the speakers. So whatever you entered has been read and will be thought about by everyone. But by no means do we want this this conversation to end. This is just an opening. Having said that, we do have time for at least one or two more questions. And this one comes from Meghna Mukherjee. That's Mukherjee. And Meghna writes, "This has been an incredible event. Thank you all. I am curious if any of the speakers have thoughts on prenatal genetic testing and how it impacts disability justice. Given how routinely testing is being implemented, sometimes even without a pregnant person's knowledge, how can we better incorporate disability and reproductive justice in this wider medical set of practices? Is prenatal genetic testing even compatible with such equity and inclusion principles?" Very easy question to answer. Wrapping up here.
I think I'll try to do my best with this one. So I mean, I think that you know, this is the tension I think that Eric was talking about at the beginning, right? And sort of the motivation behind this discussion. And so I think it's definitely relevant to you know, what we're up to today. And I think that I'm going to try to address this in the spirit of today's event and in the spirit of this whole series, and just sort of say, well, the problem is more fundamental than the technology itself, right? The technology, yes, is problematic, but it is something that has been created by a deeply ableist culture. And just sort of regulating the technology or somehow doing some kind of public education campaign that focuses on the technology itself isn't going to do the work, right? I think that the problem of ableism, you know, existed far earlier in human history than you know, discovery of the genome even. And so, you know, I think one approach to this question is, yes, to write about and talk about and think about biotechnology, but always do that with the understanding that you're embedded in sort of a deeply ableist culture. And any work you do on this issue has to be aware of the intersections of racism and ableism and heterosexism and so on that really drive the development of these technologies in the first place. And so I guess that's kind of a non-answer, but might be the best that I can do.
And I just want to kind of add on to that and say that I think this would also be a great place to consider how reproductive justice has deeply thrown into question the framework of choice that often has driven the kind of reproductive freedom conversation, right? And I think Joe explains beautifully about how choice does not occur in a vacuum, right? Choice is shaped by broader systems of ableism that make it often unthinkable for many parents, make it unthinkable that they could raise a child with a disability, right? And so I think that the kind of critique of the choice framework is really applicable here as well.
This is Sami. I just want to, some of my work is on speculative fiction. And I think that a big thing that I talk about in speculative fiction is that technology is a tool, right? So it's not inherently good or bad. And the context, as folks are talking about, matters. And so, you know, I can imagine a world where genetic testing is used so that parents know about their forthcoming child's disability and are connected to community and are educated and prepared and have the resources that they need to like joyfully raise this child, right? Like that is a world that could exist, but it's not the world we have now. So all of these other things around the technology, not just the tool itself, matters. And that's the context stuff that folks are saying, but just to kind of give a vision of a way that genetic testing could be compatible with equity and inclusion in a just world. It could exist, but all these other things would have to change.
Can I also add something as well? Joel, do we have time?
Yes,
I also just want to say that I think this is a both and. Like I just don't think that there's any easy answers here. I think that especially when we get into reproductive genetic technologies and all that whole world of things, like I think we exist in a world with binaries, and what is more true is that there's so much nuance and complexity. And you know, so I don't think that there's anything wrong with people testing prenatal genetic testing, but I do think that because that entire world of reproductive genetic technologies and that whole system is moving faster than even the laws can catch up with, which who really cares about laws, but like that's all we have to help to monitor it. That so there, I think it's a slippery slope, and that there are no easy answers. And as a disabled person who used to work in the reproductive justice movement, I never saw that as conflicting, even though it was oftentimes presented that way. I think that we all live both and lives, and that there are ways that we can, like Sami was saying, that we can understand these things in positive ways. And as Joe was talking about, right, like also understand all of the nuance. Check.
And I just, in the chat that everyone should be able to see, if I did it correctly, I dropped 2 resources. There's so much good stuff out there, but I just wanted to highlight a recent book edited by Eric Perrins, who you heard at the beginning, and Josephine Johnston, entitled Human Flourishing in an Age of Gene Editing, has some fantastic resources that address this directly, including a piece by our own Rosemary Garland Thompson. And I also linked an essay that I love by our own Joe Stramondo, that's hyperlinked there and open access, which here, let me read the title out loud. It's Disability and the Damaging Master Narrative of an Open Future. Fantastic essay. So we are going to soon run out of time. I want to ask one final question. We have maybe about only 3 to 4 minutes on this, sadly, but again, we want to continue this conversation even after this webinar ends. And this question comes from our own Liz Bowen. Mia's reflections on the quiet river of grief that attends disabled family making really resonated with me, Liz writes. There is a particular tragedy to the fact that these relationships, which can be so crucial to survival in the face of ableism, often and can buckle under the weight of those same failures of social and material support. What do you all think would need to change structurally, or most need to change structurally, to lessen the risk of these connections crashing and burning, as Mia puts it?
I guess I can start. It's funny because I don't often think about structural things when I'm thinking about these types of formations that happen around like belonging and family, disabled family and family making, because they oftentimes happen outside of those structures. Obviously structural things like ableism didn't exist anymore, white supremacy was ended, but I also think like community infrastructure could really help. That's less formal, I guess. And that is like that we actually can have communities and not just talk about them, but that they actually exist in robust ways, and that it's not only the few kind of popular folks who get to have access to community, but that it's like, and that it's not homogenous either, that we are able to build strong, vibrant communities in our communities, which sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. But, because I think right now, I think about the push for a deinstitutionalization, right? And to get disabled folks out of institutions. And I always say, well, I actually don't know that we can promise people or guarantee people that they're going to be like, that they're not going to have harm or violence or complete isolation or abuse, like if we take them out of institutions, like because our communities are so messed up as well, is a polite way to say it. So I think, like having broader communities like queer and trans people of color communities, for example, really contend with ableism and really contend with how they can build cross disability relationships, but also relationships that are not only in disability community. I think about disabled people as well, being able to have access to be able to heal trauma and be able to have access to mental health and that's affirming and that's not oppressive. I think there's so many pieces because Liz, I feel like our trauma as disabled people definitely plays out and is one of the biggest conditions, I think, that is the cause of those crash and burn dynamics, as well as structure, obviously what's going on outside, and they're interdependent and connected. So those are just some thoughts.
I wish we had time to hear from others, but I think this webinar auto shuts down. So I want to make sure that everyone is aware, this is a 6-part event. This was our last event, and I just dropped in the chat the link to information from all of these events. There are resources, readings, all sorts of things on that website that I highly recommend people to go to. I'm going to hand it over to Eric for final comments, who I believe will be thanking the NEH, Hastings Center, and all the amazing many people who have made this event and the series happen. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joel. I've tried to put on my camera, but I'm being told I can't, which is just fine. Is it possible, Liz, for somebody to put up the slide of thanks to the many people who have made this event possible? Thank you so much. Well, Joel, I think really said it all. The only thing I would add is that we are going to create a permanent record of this really marvelous series. It'll include edited versions of the videos that we've created over the last 6 events, and also some additional resources. But I'm so eager to thank everybody on this screen at the Hastings Center, our sign language resources folks, and our CART services folks, and last but not least, the National Endowment for the Humanities and Patricia Brooks in particular. You know, we live in a country where we spend something like $51 billion a year thinking about how to enhance health and make people live longer. That's the budget of our NIH. The budget of our NEH is minuscule in comparison, but it's the NEH that gives us the opportunity to ask what I think is one of the most important questions for those of us who are privileged enough to ask questions, and that is, you know, what kind of life do we want for each other? What is well-being? What is human flourishing? And that the NEH has given us a chance to ask that question on an ongoing basis for a couple of years is, to my mind, a really wonderful thing. And I just cannot overstate my gratitude to Patricia Brooks in particular and to the NEH in general. Thanks to all of you for coming today. It's been a wonderful experience. Hoping everybody stays well. Bye.